This content is recorded exclusively for Dr. Young's anatomy class. It is not to be uploaded or distributed to any social media sites or streaming sites, and not to be used without the permission of Dr. Young.
Welcome to Chapter 4. In this chapter we're going to be looking at histology, or the study of tissues. We're going to look at all the different tissues in the body, but we're just going to do an overview of them. We're going to look at these a lot closer when we do go through the different organ systems and what's making up, or the tissue that makes up, each one of these organ systems. When we're looking at histology, it is a study of tissues. So we're going to look at how they're interrelated to each other, how the actual cells are connected together, and how they're going to be hopefully coming together to serve one common function. So we're going to have 4 primary types of tissues in the body, and then there's going to be subcategories underneath each one of those different types of tissues. So the first one is going to be epithelial tissues. Epithelium is basically coverings. Skin is epithelium, the inside lining to your organs will be epitheliums, and then glands also fit into this category. So sweat glands, oil glands, endocrine glands that release hormones on the inside of the body. So it's just not glands on the outside of the body, it's also glands on the inside of the body. Connective tissue is just that, it connects different parts of the body. So there's going to be several different categories of connective tissue as well. Bone is going to be a connective tissue, cartilage, your ligaments, your tendons. So those are what we kind of think of a lot of times when we think about connective tissue. But fat is also going to be a type of connective tissue. And then blood and lymphatic fluid are also connective tissues, which don't seem like they would be connective tissues, but blood is going to fall into this category as well. Then we have muscles. Muscles we use to move. So muscles are going to contract and help to generate force, whether it's for movement of our body or movement of our heart, or if we need to constrict or dilate blood vessels. That's all going to be done with our muscle tissues, and we'll look at those different types of muscle tissues. Nervous tissue, this is going to be relaying signals or receiving signals. So our entire nervous system, from our brain, our spinal cord, all the way through our nerves, this is basically going to be an electrical system that's designed to send actual electrical signals, to send messages throughout the entire body from one cell to the next cell. Okay, here we're going to look at the different types of junctions that we have in between cells that are going to help them to either hold together or make connections with each other or be able to communicate with each other. So there's going to be 3 main types of junctions. You have tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. Tight junctions are going to be just that. They're going to be tight. They're going to interlock 2 cells together and make a nice tight seal. It may not be 100% leak proof, but it's going to be really, really tight. We see this a lot in blood vessels, in the skin, have a lot of tight junctions where we want to keep things out or keep things in. That's where you're going to find your tight junctions. Desmosomes. Desmosomes are kind of like zippers. So we do find a lot of desmosomes in the skin too, especially because we want those tight junctions to hold those cells together really tightly, but at the same time we want some flexibility in there. So if you think of a desmosome as a zipper, you can see in the picture there's going to be interlocking integral proteins that literally overlap each other just like a zipper. So it can still have a little movement in between the cells and not be quite as tightly connected together. Gap junctions are going to be literal gaps. So they still connect 2 cells together, but if we want to move something across the plasma membrane of those 2 cells, like ions or nutrients, or they need to share proteins, then those can literally move through the gaps in those cell walls, and those are going to be gap junctions. So there's all 3 types of junctions all in one place for you, so this is a pretty good review slide. You have tight junctions, you have your desmosomes, and you have your gap junctions. Okay, now we're going to look at epithelial tissue a little bit closer here. So, like we said, epithelial tissue is going to be coverings or linings. So, skin is epithelium. You're going to have epithelium lining all of your internal organs, all your blood vessels. It's going to be epithelium. Epithelium has a lot of different functions to it. First one is protection. It provides really good protection, especially with the skin. It keeps out almost everything we want to keep out unless we get a cut or we injure those cells. Immune defenses. The skin is a physical barrier. It is helping to keep bacteria out, helping to keep viruses out. We're also going to see we have white blood cells that can actually live within the epithelial tissue and basically wait for bacteria or viruses or toxins and then kill them when they do see them. We're going to have a lot of secretions in epithelium. So like we said, glands are going to be part of that epithelium. So oils, mucus, sweat, hormones. Glands can secrete things on the inside as well. So a lot of different secretions. Transport into other tissues. So selectively permeable membranes, that is mainly being made up of epithelial tissue. Since it's the covers or the linings of things, this epithelial tissue is going to get to decide what comes in and what goes out. So it acts a lot in transport in and out of different tissues. Sensation, especially in the skin. A lot of our nerves are going to be located, especially a lot of the receptors to those nerves are located up in the skin. Taste buds are an example of sensation that we have up in epithelium. So there's a lot of sensation in the epithelium. We have a couple different ways we can classify epithelium. We can call it simple or stratified. If it's simple, it's just one cell layer thick. If it's stratified, it's multiple cell layers stacked on top of each other. Epithelium can also either be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar in shape. So other than just simple or stratified, we also have to look at the shape of the cell. Squamous is classically described as like a fried egg looking appearance. It's nice and flat and thin. Cuboidal kind of make little cubes. And then columnars are actual columns. Now we can combine these two classifications. We can have simple squamous, you can have simple cuboidal, or simple columnar, or stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, or stratified columnar, depending on not only the shape, but how many layers thick it's going to be. If we look at simple epithelial first, so this is one cell layer thick, and it has that fried egg, real thin looking appearance. These tend to make up basement membranes, nice thin sheets or coverings on the inside of organs. They're really, really thin layers of tissue. When we look at these in the body, here's a little picture. They do have that kind of fried egg looking appearance. They're nice and flat. Places where we're going to find these, especially around blood vessels, around the lungs, where we have to have gas exchange occur, the thinner that area is, the better for exchange. So if we want exchange to happen, we find a lot of simple squamous epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelium, these make nice little vessels or nice little tubes. So a lot of the ducts of our glands, renal tubules, thyroid glands, tend to be made up as simple cuboidal epithelium. Respiratory ducts, also a lot of times simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple columnar epithelium. So these can have microvilli or cilia on them. A lot of times we see microvilli. Microvilli are going to be those little extensions that kind of stick up. They increase the surface area. When we look at the small intestine, we're going to see a ton of simple columnar epithelium, and it's actually used for absorption of nutrients. Pseudostratified. Now this one's kind of its own special category. That's why we're starting with it when we look at stratified epithelium. So simple was one layer. Stratified is going to be multiple layers stacked on top of each other. Pseudo means false. So this is falsely stacked or falsely stratified. When you look at these cells, it looks like they're stacked on top of each other, but they really go all the way down to the very basement membrane, the very bottom of that cell layer, and have a connection down to that very base. So it looks like they're stacked, but they're really not. Where we find this a lot is actually up in the lungs or in our respiratory tract. You find a lot of mucus cells in between these pseudostratified columnar cells, and these are going to produce mucus, and then you have these long hairs looking structures on the top. These are going to be the cilia. So this is actually going to embed mucus within the cilia, and it can trap dust particles, debris that we breathe in. The cilia will sweep it back up to our throat, we can swallow it, and then our stomach acid can break it down. Stratified, just normal stratified epithelium. So this is going to be our layers stacked on top of each other with our normal shapes. So the first one we have is going to be stratified squamous keratinized. So keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. This is going to be our skin. So keratin is a nice protein that makes a nice water-resistant layer and provides extra protection. So we see it on the top layer of our skin. And underneath that will be the actual squamous cells that are stacked on top of each other to make it stratified squamous. Provides really good protection. We can also have stratified squamous that's non-keratinized. So this just is missing that keratin on that very top layer. We tend to have these openings in the body. So rectum, we find it in the vagina, we find it in the mouth, where we still need some protection. We need those cell layers stacked on top of each other, but we don't need that extra waterproof keratin layer to be there. Stratified cuboidal, don't worry about these too much. We don't find them very many places in the body, mainly just sweat ducts is the main place we're going to find them, so don't worry about those. Stratified columnar, there again, we don't find actual stratified columnar too often. We find pseudostratified columnar a lot, but not straight stratified. We find them in salivary glands, some parts of the eye, some parts of the urethra, but there again, really rare. Don't worry about those. Transitional epithelium. So this one is kind of in its own separate category, kind of like pseudostratified. We're going to find this in the bladder and the ureters. What happens with this is it looks like these cells are all stacked up in a really nice big layer. And a lot of these are going to be cuboidal layers, but some of them will also look a little bit like squamous. But what tends to happen with this, especially since we find it in the bladder and why it's called transitional, this tissue is going to go through a transition. It's going to look like it's stacked on top of each other, but then it's going to gradually, as that bladder fills up, it's going to start to stretch, and it starts to flatten out and looks like it's less stacked on top of each other and a little bit more flat. So it's kind of in its own special category. It's still epithelium, but it's transitional epithelium. And these next two slides are basically just reviewing your different types of epithelium. So here we have the simple squamous, we have simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and then our pseudostratified. Next slide, we have our stratified squamous epithelium that can be keratinized or non-keratinized. Then stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, like I said, don't worry about those two. And then we end with our transitional epithelium. So this slide and the last slide make really good review slides. It has the functions of all of them listed. It has the location of where you're going to find them. I'm more interested in that you know the location right now of where you're going to find these. It is good to know overall big function, but focus mainly on location. All right, last part of epithelium is going to be our glands. So we can have endocrine glands or we can have exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are going to release hormones on the inside. That's where endo comes from. Exo will release everything on the outside. Exo means outside. When we look at our endocrine glands, we're talking about hormones. So hormones. They get released directly in the bloodstream and they travel all through the inside of their body, basically for a long distance type of communication. Exocrine glands, this is going to be your sweat glands, your oil glands, your mucus glands. These are all exocrine glands. So they actually excrete to the external surface, usually for moisture, to keep us lubricated, that type of thing. Or if it's sweat glands, it's going to be to keep us cool. A goblet cell is a good example. This is just a mucus gland. It's a fancy name for a mucus gland. We have more mucus glands than we do almost any other type of gland. Find it in the intestinal tract, find it in the respiratory tract. We find it everywhere, and we're going to look at several different types of mucus glands as we go through our different body systems. Up next is going to be connective tissues. So, have different categories of connective tissue. You can have connective tissue proper or specialized connective tissue. Big functions of connective tissue. So, connects and binds. And that's what we're mainly looking at. It provides really good support when we look at bones and cartilage. It does provide relatively good protection if we're looking at the skull, or even if we're looking at the sternum or ribs, protecting our heart and lungs. Transport is kind of the tricky one. So don't forget, blood is actually going to be a type of connective tissue. And it's going to transport oxygen, carbon dioxide, can transport ions, nutrients, proteins, basically whatever you want to transport. Blood is going to transport it. It falls into that connective tissue category. So we're going to go and look directly at the review sites here with all our connective tissue in one place. This first one is connective tissue proper, and then the next slide will be our specialized connective tissue. In connective tissue proper, if you look at this loose connective tissue, this is going to be mainly areolar connective tissue. This is kind of like packing. Whenever we have an emptier space internally, a lot of the times we'll pack it with this loose connective tissue so we just don't have empty space there. So walls of organs, membranes, linings, we find a lot of this areolar or loose connective tissue. Then we have dense connective tissue. This can be irregular, it can be regular, or elastic. Irregular, dense connective tissue. When we look at the skin, we're going to find some of this in the skin. We're also going to find it around joints. When we look at regular, dense tissue, this is going to be our tendons and ligaments. Elastic, we find a lot of elastic dense tissue in blood vessels is the main place where we're going to find it. Then if we go down a little further, we have reticular connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue, I always kind of think of a sponge. If you push your thumb down in it and then pull it out, that sponge slowly takes its original shape. That's what reticular connective tissue is going to do. I always think of liver. We have a ton of reticular connective tissue in the liver. It's kind of spongy. If you push your thumb down into it slightly, it would kind of go back to that original shape. And then we have adipose. Fat is a type of connective tissue. We find fat around the heart. We find fat surrounding the kidneys. We find fat all over the body. It's helping to connect. It helps to bind. It helps to support. Find it just everywhere. It's also going to fall in that connective tissue proper. Then we have our specialized connective tissue. This is going to be our cartilage, our bone, and then our blood. So cartilage, it provides good support like bone, but it's more flexible. It can be hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, or elastic cartilage. What we tend to see when we look at cartilage, we have these little halo-shaped cells. When we talk about especially cartilage and bone a little later on in other chapters, we're going to see chondrocytes, which is a cartilage cell. It lives in a little kind of pocket called a lacunae. Where you see the little halo kind of going around the dot, the little white circle going around the dot, those are those chondrocytes in those lacunae. Hyaline cartilage we tend to find in between joints. We find some in the respiratory tract and where our ribs connect to our sternum. Fibrocartilage makes up our intervertebral disc along our vertebrae. Elastic cartilage is usually what we're a little bit more familiar with. That's making up things like our ears. So when you can bend your ear, it still has good support to it, but it's made up of that elastic cartilage. Bone. We're going to talk a lot about bones. It provides really good support, But we also have ion storage. Calcium is mainly going to be stored in the bone. So we're going to look a lot at bone. And then blood. So blood, this is going to be transport connective tissue. So like I said, transporting oxygen, CO2, ions, proteins, nutrients, waste, whatever you want to transport, blood is going to transport it. It's one of those specialized connective tissues. Up next is going to be muscles. So muscles are used for contractions. We're going to have 3 different types of muscles that we're going to look at, but they're all contracting. So whenever we're looking at them, they're going to be doing some type of contraction. Our 3 big groups here are going to be skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Looking at skeletal muscle first. When you generally think about muscle, this is usually the muscle you're thinking about. It's voluntary. We're going to see that it's made up of several different muscle fibers, so it can contract right. It's usually multinucleate, which means there's multiple nucleuses in there, because they're going to be responsible for making a lot of protein. A lot of times when we use muscles, we are actually breaking down some of those fibers. The fibers get damaged, and then we make new proteins, new fibers, to build that muscle up. It's what weightlifters do all the time to get their muscles bigger. They increase those number of fibers in there. And we can do that easily because we do have all those nuclei in there that can help to make all those extra protein. And this is voluntary. So when you think about moving a skeletal muscle, you can actually move an arm, move a leg, move that muscle. Here's a nice little picture of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is always striated. So if you look, you can see the stripes going through this muscle, and then the purple nucleuses are found all around the edge of those muscle fibers in there. So it's pretty distinct fibers when you look at it. Cardiac muscle. This is going to be an involuntary muscle. So cardiac muscle just works. That's because it's making up your heart. The heart is the only place in the body you find cardiac muscle. You don't have to think about your heart beating in order to get it to beat. It just works. The major feature you find in cardiac muscle is going to be intercalated disc. These are going to be gap junctions modified with tight junctions. It's a little bit of each. It helps to hold the cells together really tight. Your heart's beating 24 hours a day, and sometimes extremely fast. If you decide to exercise or that heart rate starts to get increased, then those cells have to have a nice tight connection, but they also have to be able to talk to each other. We have to have our heart organized. We have 2 chambers on top, 2 chambers on bottom. We have to fill the heart up with blood and then pump that blood out. These intercalated discs are going to help with that organization so we get that heart to pump like it needs to pump. And here's a nice picture of the cardiac muscle. This is always described as like a tree branching looking effect to it. When you look at this muscle, you can kind of see that it does branch out, but you have these real dark lines in between these muscle fibers. Those real dark lines are those intercalated discs. So that's what really jumps out whenever I see cardiac muscle, are those intercalated discs, and then also somewhat of that branching appearance. Last type of muscle is going to be smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is going to look smooth. That's why it's called smooth muscle. This is going to be another involuntary. So you don't have to think about it to get it to work. It's just going to work. The main place where we're going to find smooth muscle, especially along our blood vessels, where we need constriction and dilation to help control that blood pressure, we find a lot of the smooth muscle in our blood pressure. But we can also find it in our organs. So when we do have muscle, especially on the interior, on the inside of our organs or around organs, it tends to be smooth muscle. So when you look at it, it looks smooth. You don't have stripes, you don't have those striations, you don't have intercalated disc. These are just nice, smooth fibers with nuclei stuck in between them. Last type of tissue is going to be nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is used to communicate. So this is making up all of our neurons in our brain and our spinal cord, all the way out to the tips of our fingers, tips of our toes, is going to be this nervous tissue. Now, we are also going to look at neuroglia cells when we do look at the nervous system a little bit closer. These are going to be helper supporting cells. So they're not necessarily sending the message, you're just making sure those neurons have everything that they need to have to send those messages. We're going to have several different parts of our neurons. The cell body or soma is going to be the same thing. That's going to be where the nucleus is found and is going to be the main body. Its cytoplasm is there, your organelles are there. Axon is going to be a nice long tail extending from the soma or cell body. This is going to be the part that's responsible for sending a nerve impulse or that electrical signal down to the next cell so it can actually communicate with the next cell down the line. Dendrites are going to look like little tree branches that are coming into the cell body or soma. This is the part that actually receives information from all the other neurons around it. The axon sends that electrical signal, and then the dendrites bring in that information, and then the cell body can actually determine if it needs to send it on to the next cell or what it needs to do about it. So here's a picture of our neuron. So you can see the big main center section is going to be that cell body or soma. Have the nucleus there in the center. Most of these little branches coming off of that cell body, those are all going to be dendrites. Now, you're going to have one, and this one kind of comes off towards the right side here, one really long axon, and this is what's going to send the electrical impulse or the nerve signal down to your next cell. And we're going to look at how that works when we do look at the nervous system. This is just giving you an introduction to it. So those are your big four main types of tissues that you're going to find in the body. And like I said, as we do go through our different systems, we're going to look at them closer and which ones we find more or in what combination in our different systems. Main thing to focus on here is to know the different categories, their big main function, and where you're primarily going to find them in the body.